Welcome to another episode of No Free Lunch, and I cannot wait for what we're going to talk about today. The late Jude Wanniski famously wrote The Way the World Works, a book that he intended to be a defense of supply-side economics. But The Way the World Works was not a book about how it should work. He was describing the way it just does work. Like we're informing a whole lot of people out there that don't otherwise know that guess what? Human beings respond to incentives. This has been called supply-side economics over the last 40 or 50 years in sort of a political and policy context. But today we're going to talk about it as something else. Incentives. They're a description of how we were made and how we behave. Supply-side economics is just an application of what is, whether we like it or not. Today, we're going to talk about incentives as the heart of economics. Let me ask you a question. Do you have to be incentivized to go consume things, to go do the things you enjoy doing, to take a vacation, to buy a nice meal? If you love a certain hobby, is there something that has to prod you to do it? Assuming you can afford it and you have the time to do it, doesn't consuming come pretty natural? See, this to me is at the heart of economic fallacy. If incentives are the heart of economics, that people are going to respond to what they're either positively or negatively incentivized around, and they're going to respond accordingly, they're going to respond rationally, it seems to me that what we want in our economy to drive a better outcome, to drive more output, is incentives towards production. And that's not because consumption's a bad thing. It's because none of us need to be incentivized to consume. We intuitively have appetites and taste that drive us towards those satisfactions and those enjoyments. Incentives to produce enable us to flourish. Incentives to produce put us on the production side of the economy, where we can actually generate growth, where we can make an impact for humanity. So why do incentives matter? Because that's what economics fundamentally is when we're negatively incentivized from doing things or positively incentivized, humans respond rationally. They can't help it. That's how we were created. However, to the extent that we know what we want to drive growth, to drive prosperity, to drive a higher quality of life, to drive higher goods and services that exist for more choice, more freedom, more opportunity, we want more production. So this whole term that came about, supply-side economics, it's nothing more than us talking about incentives to produce, because we don't need incentives to consume. This is what can lift the most people out of poverty, when we have incentives in place for activities that defeat impoverishment. This, to me, is the fundamental difference between 20th century Keynesian economics and where we want to go with the 21st century economics of freedom and virtue, is driving incentives to free yet virtuous behavior. This, to me, is the heart of what has been called supply-side economics. I want to start real quickly with a 20th century criticism of where economic thought went. And it started with the idea, I would argue somewhat understandably, prima facie, that out of the Great Depression, something that was needed was Americans to start consuming more. And really you could apply the same thing in European economies as well. So there was this general belief that we needed to incentivize people to consume. And that idea has all sorts of problems in terms of government deficits and how we go about financing these things and what it's done to create runaway spending for governments all over the world, not just here in the United States. But fundamentally, I think the flaw of it was it failed to understand where wealth comes from, where actual productive behavior comes from, which was not ever on the consumption side of the economy. People produce towards the aim of someone else consuming, but before that person can consume, they first have to produce to afford what they want to consume, and you have to first produce so that they have something to consume. So there's two parts of production coming into one part of consumption. It's this virtuous cycle of economic activity. And then out of this production is not only a person who gets to consume and have their appetite satisfied in whatever good or service it may be. Presumably, the reason they're consuming it is because it's meeting a human need. It's satisfying some desire or need they have in their life. Otherwise, they wouldn't be consuming it. This doesn't seem very complicated to me. But what you have is an inability throughout economic academic thought to keep our eye on the ball of what most needs incentive in the public square, which is ongoing productive economic activity. We say, well, how can we incentivize people to produce? And I say, you know what? Maybe you can't. Maybe you just have to stop disincentivizing them to produce. The negative aspect of incentive is really what gave birth to the supply side revolution. Excessively high taxation, excessively high regulation that served as an impediment to people doing otherwise very natural and very beneficial, productive activity. There is a basic rule of thumb when it comes to the financial aspect of this that I very much want you to understand. Savings equals investment. Now, this is very simple because we know that there is no dollar that can be invested into real estate, into the stock market, into starting a new business, into investing in your friend's lemonade stand. There's no investment if that dollar wasn't first saved. So all invested dollars have to be first saved. So we want higher savings to drive higher investment. This is a tautology. It's inherently true. The question then becomes, do we believe greater investment will lead to more productivity? And again, this is somewhat indisputable. So to the extent we want to drive higher productivity, we need higher investment, which first comes from higher savings. What do we get out of higher productivity? We get more growth. The more productive of an economy we have, the more growth. The more growth you have, there's more profits, there's more wages, there's more people being hired. All of these great things that can, in a macroeconomic context, happen, all lead to an enhanced quality of life, human flourishing. Remember that? This is coming because we first incentivize saving and incentivized investment so that we can incentivize greater investment, which will in turn create greater productivity and greater growth. This natural understanding of incentives and the progression of healthy economic activity should not be controversial. But instead of focusing on the positive incentives that we can have to drive a more prosperous society, to drive the kinds of activities that not only bring people more fulfillment, but really do create the opportunities that lead to new inventions, new products, new ways of doing things, that just time and time again have led to a better humanity. Instead of focusing on positive incentives, we have to spend our time trying to limit negative incentives. And this to me is totally unacceptable if we're wanting to build a framework that is driven towards the objectives we've talked about on No Free Lunch. For entrepreneurs, you should intuitively understand that human beings respond either positively to good incentives or negatively to bad incentives, and build a compensation framework, build a culture at your company, build a full environment that facilitates this type of incentive-based thinking. It is the best system we've concocted to align incentives with human activity, human decision-making, and indeed, as we talked about earlier, human action. So I'm very excited to continue the subject of incentives with our guest today, who happens to be a hero of mine, one of my very closest friends, Larry Kudlow, who has served as an economic advisor in both the Reagan and Trump administrations, currently has his own very successful show on Fox Business, leading economic mind, great pal, and one of the fathers of supply side economics. Let's bring on my friend Larry Kudlow. So we're talking about incentives in economics and the idea of incentives sort of being the centerpiece of the way in which people act. And I wanted to bring on Larry Kudlow because I believe you, as one of the fathers of supply side economics, have a lot to say on the subject. And when I look at the world we're in right now and the current state of the economy, I'm going to start there, Larry. How are current incentives or disincentives working against economic growth?
Well, look, I think, we saved America and killed the bill. So tax rates did not go up. And I don't think they will. However, there are two major disincentives working now. One of them is the rapid increase of inflation. And the other one is this regulatory octopus, as I call it, which has extended its tentacles, particularly into strangling the oil and gas business. But not only oil and gas. I mean, they're trying to get into banking as well. So let's see, my friend Dougie Holtz-Eakin's group calculated that in his first year, Biden increased federal regulations by just over $200 billion, which is an enormous, enormous sum. And, those kinds of regulations, whether it's paperwork, red tape, whether it's no permitting for pipelines or drilling for oil and gas, or whether it's allocating credit, bank credit away from fossil companies, or whether it's forcing climate regulations into investors or investment funds or banks, getting them to move away from any fossil fuels. All of those things are disincentives that essentially throw sand in the gears of the economy. And then, of course, the inflation problem, which is growing, is getting worse in my judgment, not better, and is going to continue to get worse for a while. That means if you look at a rate of return, whether it's a rate of return on labor or a rate of return on capital investment, that means your real after-tax return goes down. Even though they haven't messed with the tax rate yet, the inflation rate drives it lower. And in fact, that's probably the case for the entire economy. It's like anti-supply side economics, what we're witnessing.
Because supply side economics dealt with real rates of return when it came to after tax, but it really has to be assessed that way after inflation as well. Incentives come down to cash in pocket that buys things.
Yeah, I think that's right. Arthur Laffer coined the phrase apocryphally, if you tax something, you get less of it. And if you tax something less, you get more of it, whether that's work effort or investment or risk taking. And you're right, that has to be judged on an after inflation basis as well as an after tax basis. Inflation is a tax. So this has gummed up the works, and my view is it's really eating away from the economy. It's a huge problem. I think the chances that this improving are very low, are very, very low. Now the cavalry is coming. I think you'll get a GOP sweep in November, but you really need to take the White House to change the regulatory problems and really to drive the inflation problems. I mean, you need less deficit spending. You need less money creation. If you look at a commodity price roll, the dollar is sinking lower and lower. So, these are things that are much more readily done by the executive branch, led by the White House, than they are by Congress. So I think we're in for a rough period.
So Larry, you're going through all the big categories of supply side thinking, and I'm equating incentives in economics with the philosophy of supply side economics, which is largely a philosophy I learned under you. And you mentioned our friend Art Laffer and Forbes, but I want to go back in time because you've written also the history of this. And of course, we know the Reagan Revolution and the guys that were there in the White House with you. But John Kennedy, who in a lot of ways was a supply sider, can you just talk briefly about how his reduction of capital gain tax was one of the first evidences of supply side incentive-based thinking working?
Well, JFK lowered marginal tax rates across the board. He understood this rate of return. He called it discouraging economic activity or encouraging. That's how he put it in several speeches. And, you know, that's a really lovely way to put it. And he was schooled, David, he was schooled by his Treasury Secretary, who was an Eisenhower Republican named Douglas Dillon, a Wall Street banker and society figure in New York City. And Doug Dillon persuaded Kennedy, but JFK kind of knew anyway. And remember, during the campaign of 1960, it was JFK who was the growth candidate, and it was Nixon who defended Eisenhower's, you know, so-called deficit reduction and high taxes, which created a bunch of recessions and high unemployment. And JFK was the first supply sider since the Harding-Coolidge-Mellon 1920s.
So back then, incentive-based thinking and the supply side philosophy wasn't as partisan as it's become today. It was more apolitical, and it was really more kind of classically economic.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. The political point is really interesting because one reason JFK got his tax cuts through was he had the support of Wilbur Mills. He was for lower tax rates. And in fact, this is sort of mind-blowing. Norman Ture was the top economist for Wilbur Mills, and they were hatching all kinds of supply-side tax cuts. And the other point I want to make is, and to your idea of the different politics, in the Senate, Russell Long was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. And he came pretty close to being a supply side. So you're quite right. The Democratic Party was much, much different in those days. And you had, you know, what you might call fiscal conservatives or pro-business Democrats who worked with Kennedy, because the liberal wing of the Democratic Party did not like Kennedy and did not trust Kennedy. They were, you know, Adlai Stevenson types.
Yeah. Well, and of course, there were Republicans who were skeptical of supply side thinking as well. So that nonpartisanship kind of cut both ways. And I guess one of the great progresses of the supply side movement is we more or less took over the Republican Party. It's almost a sign of orthodoxy now that you believe in incentive-based economics, but the Democrats went the other way. And here we are with this economic polarization.
Yeah, you know, the Republicans in the 50s and 60s and 70s were hopeless.
Yeah.
Except for, you know, you had Bob Taft, who was a supply sider, but he could never overthrow the Eastern liberal wing of the Republican Party, which was essentially the Eisenhower, Henry Cabot Lodge, Nelson Rockefeller wing. And they were a real pain in the ass because they never wanted to cut taxes. They were welfare type Republicans. And they always argued, it was great, we can't cut taxes because it'll increase the deficit. So what they did was they spent money to increase the deficit. I mean, it was just silly. And so Reagan comes along, and part of Reagan's victory in 1980 was he basically overthrew the Rockefeller wing of the party.
So let's move off of the politics real quick. And before I let you go, in corporate America, I'm wondering if you think that the supply side mentality and the things that Laffer's talked about, you tax more of something, you're going to get less of it, and vice versa. Do you think Musk and Bezos and guys at that strata of economic achievement, are they impacted by incentives as well? Or is there a sense in which George Gilder is on this theme now, that supply sideism has a lot more efficacy at a lower level, but there's also a sense in which free markets just require the ideas and the thinking of big visionary people. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think George is right. New business owners, startup owners, and in general, the small business community, I kind of think of it as the NFIB, National Federation of Independent Business. Supply side is alive and well. It's very, very strong. In terms of the upper strata of the billionaires, David, and I would probably put you in the lead as the supply side billionaires. But I would also suggest my sometimes friend Elon Musk understands this stuff as well or better than anybody I ever met. I had some dealings with him in the White House. I'm not a pal of his, but I had some dealings with him in the White House. And I've watched him in the last couple of years. And he basically said, I think when we were fighting the Build Back Better package, he just came out and said one day, we don't need any of this stuff. And I just loved it. That's so totally Musk. Elon is a libertarian and he just wants freedom to, run his businesses, invent and create and innovate. And he does a pretty good job. I don't know about, I think Bezos was much better 20, 25 years ago when Jim Cramer and I had him on our old CNBC show after his first quarterly profit, when essentially he was a bookstore. I've kind of lost hope in Bezos. And, in the corporate suite, it varies, okay? It varies. You've got a lot of wokeness going on right now. I think it's a passing fad. But if you get these guys, a lot of these CEOs, David, if you get them personally, with a cup of coffee or some private lunch, they used to come visit me in my office on the second floor of the West Wing. You could hear them. They did understand incentives. They did understand free markets. But then they go out and when they hit the microphones, they sing a different tune. So it's kind of strange, kind of weird.
Yeah, but that's a big part of what we're trying to do here with this effort is I'm not going to put up with it anymore. From Wall Street, from corporate America, they can't climb the ladder of free enterprise and get up to where they want to be and then kick the ladder over and pretend like they don't know how it all happened. And so I think that you're right. There's a sense at the NFIB level, small business, family business, incentives not just matter, they're everything. And when one has the luxury of Musk and Bezos and being at that strata, perhaps the thinking changes a bit, but the policies still have to be driven to support the little guy, support free enterprise. And so we'll close with that. If President Biden called you and said, I want you, Larry Kudlow, come back to National Economic Council that you directed under President Trump. I want you to come back for one day, and you get a wand for one day, implement some policy to drive supply side policy and economic growth. What would you do right now if you had one day back at the helm?
Well, there's a lot of things I'd recommend, but the very first thing I would do is get Biden in Air Force One and take him to a big conference in Midland, Texas, home of the Permian Basin oil fields, which is the greatest oil producing area in the world. And I'd like to sit down with all these oil and gas fossil guys, particularly the independents, and let him hear their story and understand the things that he's doing wrong. And say to him, sir, we're all for renewables, but you're never going to solve energy. You're never going to be independent unless you nurture innovation in oil and gas, which makes it clean burning fuels, and nuclear. And so we get away from this regulatory octopus that's strangling our energy sector and we become independent again. You know, David, I really believe if the Keystone Pipeline, I've been told by industry people, the Keystone Pipeline could be completed in 1 year by the first quarter of 23. And Alberta can ship 800,000 barrels of oil. I mean, I've spoken to the guy. The Permian could produce another 2 million barrels of oil within 18 months, okay? And then you'd have contributions from Marcellus and Bakken and so forth. I mean, we could recover our position as energy independent, wouldn't have to worry about Russia. God knows we should never worry about oil with Iran and Venezuela. Probably we should create a whole North American independent energy zone, Canada, US, and Mexico. That's an idea. I was at dinner last night with John Katzimatidis, who was in the oil business, and that was one of his thoughts. Bring in Mexico, bring in Canada. They're actually friends of ours. They're not communists. They're friends of ours. They like us.
Well, they're not communist and they're not jihadist.
Yeah, and they're not jihadists, yes. So, I would say other things to Joe Biden, stop the deficit spending. But I think his biggest mistake has been the regulatory mistake aimed at fossil fuels for, domestic economic security and for national security.
Well, I think it's a great place to end because it's a very serious application that would move the needle in economic growth, and it would move the needle because of what we're talking about, which is supply side incentives, not of the tax variety that you guys did in the Reagan Revolution, but of the regulatory variety, yet it's still the same principle, incentives to produce and grow, and that regulatory problem that we have got to do something about.
By the way, P.S., Reagan was a deregulator.
Oh, yeah.
Big deregulator. And Reagan decontrolled the price of oil in his first couple of weeks in office. And my friend, the late James Schlesinger, was wrong. Oil prices went down, not up. And the gas lines disappeared.
Yep, that's right. Larry, thank you so much for the time. Thank you for your insights, as always. Appreciate you, my friend.
Thanks, Dave. See you soon. Thanks a million.
Ultimately, when we get incentives wrong in our administration of an economy, all we do is deteriorate freedom. We make the productive less productive. And as I've tried at great lengths to point out, that's not merely an economic crime, it's a moral crime. We want people to be in their full capacity for productivity, yes, for wealth building, but also for total maximum fulfillment. We can't get the incentives wrong if we are to maximize freedom and opportunity in a society. Thanks for watching No Free Lunch. We'll be back with another episode soon.